Inter-System Collegiate Station 7 floated in the neutral zone between 6 different star systems, a monument to cooperative education and the naive belief that teenagers from different species could coexist without starting an interstellar incident. The station administrators had, through 3 decades of trial and considerable error, according to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Managed to establish protocols that kept the various species from accidentally poisoning, crushing, or psychologically scarring each other. Mostly. The dormitory wings radiated out from the central academic sphere like spokes on a wheel, each section carefully calibrated for specific atmospheric compositions, gravity levels, and most importantly, separation distances. The Vrix needed their sulfur-rich environment. The Kelton required precisely 1.4 standard gravities and temperatures that would make most species question their life choices. The Quilnari demanded complete darkness during their rest cycles. Everyone had their requirements, their boundaries, their little boxes of comfort in the vast, uncomfortable universe. Then there were the humans, tucked away in Section D7, behind doors that required 3 separate authorization checks and a liability waiver that most species refused to read past the first paragraph. Nobody talked much about why the humans were isolated. Oh, there were official reasons plastered across the administrative bulletins. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, check. Earth standard gravity, naturally. Circadian rhythm requirements, sure. But the real reason, the one that made seasoned station personnel exchange knowing glances, remained diplomatically unmentioned in polite conversation. Humans were weird. Not dangerous weird, not exactly. Not the kind of weird that required armed guards or sedation protocols. Just profoundly, inexplicably, uncomfortably weird in ways that made the other species deeply uneasy. They smiled, showing their teeth. They made direct eye contact. They touched each other casually, constantly, without any regard for proper social boundaries. Worst of all, they seemed to find nearly everything either hilarious or worthy of adoption. The Quilnari Council had issued 17 separate warnings about human behavior after one of them tried to pick up a Quilnari elder because it looked fluffy. The elder had been fine, physically. Emotionally was another matter entirely, which brought us to the current situation, though nobody knew it was a situation yet. The Threxian cub was approximately 4 months old by human standards, covered in dense silver-blue fur that rippled with each awkward movement. Her species, the Threxians, were apex predators on their homeworld, all claws and fangs and hunting instincts once they reached maturity. As cubs, however, they were about as threatening as a particularly determined cotton ball. This particular cub had been deemed mature enough to accompany her parent to the station, where said parent served as a visiting professor in quantum mechanics. Big mistake. Cubs were curious. Cubs were adventurous. Cubs did not understand that certain sections of the station were marked as restricted for very good reasons that would be explained when they were older and better at understanding complex socio-political dynamics. The ventilation system, it turned out, connected all the dormitory sections. This was intentional, part of the station's efficient air recycling program. What was not intentional was that the grates were just barely large enough for a determined Threxian cub to squeeze through, provided she really committed to the squeezing. She committed. The journey through the ducts was long, dark, and smelled like 17 different species' idea of comfortable living. The cub navigated by instinct and the faint air currents that suggested openness ahead. She passed over the Vrix dormitories, too sulfuric. She bypassed the Kelton section, too hot. She wriggled past the Quilnari quarters, too cold and dark. Then she found it, a current of air that smelled strange but not unpleasant. Warm, oxygen-rich. Something in her tiny predator brain registered it as safe, or at least interesting enough to investigate. The grate opened into a room dimmed for night cycle. The cub dropped onto soft carpeting, her padded paws making absolutely no sound. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust, her ears swiveling to catch any hint of danger. The room was smaller than her family's quarters, arranged with the peculiar efficiency humans seem to favor. A desk cluttered with data pads and actual paper notebooks, because humans still used physical writing materials like some kind of primitive species that had just discovered fire. A chair with clothing draped over it. Shelves containing books, actual bound books, and small decorative items that served no functional purpose whatsoever. And a bed. The cub approached cautiously, following that instinct that all young predators had. The one that said safe sleeping spots were precious and should be investigated thoroughly. A figure lay there, curled on its side, one arm tucked under something soft and rectangular. A pillow. The human breathed slowly, deeply, completely unaware of the intruder. The cub sniffed carefully. The scent was alien but not threatening. Warm-blooded. Mammalian, if that classification meant anything across species. Most importantly, asleep. The bed was elevated off the ground, requiring a jump the cub calculated carefully. She bunched her haunches, sprang, and landed on the mattress with a tiny bounce that somehow didn't wake the sleeping occupant. Humans, apparently, slept like the dead. This would become relevant later. The pillow looked incredibly comfortable. The human had her head on one end, leaving a perfectly cub-sized space on the other end. The cub circled once, twice, then settled into the spot with a contentment that came from finding exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The pillow was soft. The blankets were warm. The steady breathing of the human created a rhythm that the cub's own breathing naturally synchronized with. Within moments, she was asleep, curled into a tiny ball of fur. Absolutely convinced she had found the best sleeping spot in the entire station. She had no idea the chaos she was about to cause. The human, for her part, continued sleeping, blissfully unaware that her pillow now hosted an apex predator infant, from a species whose adults were banned from close proximity interactions with humans due to Incident Report 7743B, which nobody liked to discuss, but everyone remembered. The night cycle continued. The station rotated through its carefully programmed artificial day. Somewhere in the Threxian quarters, a parent would soon wake to find an empty sleeping pod and immediately assume the worst. But for now, in room D733, a human and a cub slept peacefully, sharing a pillow in what would soon become the most diplomatically complicated nap in the station's entire history. The universe, if it paid attention to such things, might have chuckled at the absurdity brewing in that small room. But the universe was busy with more important matters, like entropy and the gradual heat death of everything. It would catch up on the entertainment later. The alarm started in the Threxian quarters at approximately 600 station time, which was precisely when the parent rolled over to check on the cub and found nothing but an empty sleeping pod and a ventilation grate that looked suspiciously displaced. What followed could only be described as controlled hysteria, if one was being generous with the word controlled. Station security received the call at 0603. By 0605, every available officer had been routed to their emergency stations. By 0607, the station administrator was being dragged from her own sleeping quarters, clutching a coffee that hadn't finished brewing and wearing an expression that suggested she was reevaluating every career choice that had led her to this moment. A missing Threxian cub was not just a lost child situation. It was a potential diplomatic incident, a safety hazard, and depending on where the cub had wandered, possibly a criminal investigation waiting to happen. Threxian cubs might look like animated stuffed toys, but their species had very specific ideas about cub safety that bordered on the obsessive. Understandably so, given that their mortality rate before the age of maturity hovered around 40% on their homeworld. Off their homeworld, in a space station full of aliens, that protectiveness multiplied exponentially. The parent, whose name translated roughly to Keen Eye in Twilight but who went by Professor Thex for convenience, was currently demonstrating exactly why Threxians had a reputation for controlled aggression. controlled being the operative word, but barely. "Where is my cub?" The translation matrix struggled with the underlying growl, settling for adding stress markers to the text display. The security chief, Kelton named Vrix, who had thought he'd seen everything in his 20 years of station duty, was quickly discovering he had not, in fact, seen everything. "We're reviewing all surveillance data now, Professor. The tracking protocols show—" "Tracking protocols." The professor's fur stood on end, making them appear twice their normal size. "My cub is 4 months old and currently wandering a station with 17 different species, 3 of whom consider Threxian cubs a delicacy, and you're reviewing data?" This was, technically speaking, an exaggeration. Only one species had ever expressed culinary interest in Threxian cubs, and that had been a cultural misunderstanding that everyone agreed to never mention again. But Vrix understood the sentiment behind the hyperbole. "We've initiated lockdown of all public areas and are conducting systematic sweeps. The cub cannot have gone far." Famous last words, those. The surveillance review took precious minutes that felt like hours. The technician tracked the cub's progress through the ventilation system with growing dread, watching the little silver-blue form squeeze through ducts, navigate junctions, and eventually disappear into a section of the station that made everyone in the security office go very, very quiet. "She went into the human dormitories," the technician announced, managing to make it sound like a death sentence. The room erupted. Not in volume, because space station personnel learned early that panic was best expressed through frantic activity rather than noise. Officers scrambled for equipment. The doctor on duty began pulling up medical files. Someone initiated the emergency contact protocol for the human residential advisor. Professor Thex went very still, which somehow was more terrifying than the earlier agitation. "The human section," they repeated very quietly. "My cub is in the human section." "We'll retrieve her immediately," Vrix promised, though his certainty had taken a significant hit. "The humans are mostly harmless, Professor. The isolation protocols are more about cultural compatibility than safety concerns." This was technically true. Also technically irrelevant, because the professor's species had some very specific ideas about what constituted danger, and humans checked several concerning boxes on that list. They were predators. Check. They had binocular forward-facing eyes. Check. They showed their teeth when expressing positive emotions, which was frankly disturbing. Check. They had a documented history of adopting anything that stayed still long enough, including things that actively tried to kill them. Very much check. "Assemble a retrieval team," the administrator ordered, having finally processed enough caffeine to form executive decisions. "Full safety protocols. Treat this as a Code 7 extraction." Code 7 meant potential hostile environment. It meant protective gear. It meant approaching with extreme caution and having medical personnel on standby. It meant everyone was taking this way too seriously, but nobody was willing to say that out loud. The team assembled outside Section D7 within 12 minutes. 6 security officers, 2 medical personnel, Professor Thex, and the administrator, who had decided that her presence might prevent an interstellar incident if things went sideways. They looked ridiculous. The security officers wore full environmental suits, despite the human section maintaining perfectly breathable atmosphere. The medical team carried enough emergency supplies to treat everything from simple scratches to complete biological incompatibility. Professor Thex wore nothing except their own fur and a look that promised violence if anything had happened to their cub. The residential advisor for the human section met them at the security door, looking confused and deeply concerned at the armed response team standing in the hallway. "Is there an emergency? The students are still in sleep cycle." "A Threxian cub entered this section approximately 3 hours ago," Vrix explained, trying to sound professional while wearing a helmet that made him look like he was preparing for chemical warfare. "We need to locate her immediately." The advisor blinked. "A cub? Like a baby Threxian?" "Yes, small, silver-blue fur, approximately this large." The administrator gestured with her hands. We tracked her to one of the rooms. We need access. Which room? The technician consulted their datapad. D733. The advisor's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, realization, concern, and then something that might have been suppressed amusement. That's okay. Let me just say that if anything happened, it probably wasn't intentional. The student in that room is very responsible, very careful, and very definitely still asleep because her alarm doesn't go off for another hour. We need immediate access, Professor Thex growled. Right, yes, absolutely. The advisor pulled up their override credentials. Just, maybe approach quietly. Humans can be very startled when they wake up to armed security teams in their bedroom. The door unsealed with a soft hiss. The team entered the human dormitory hallway, which looked disappointingly normal. Soft lighting adjusted for human circadian rhythms. Doors marked with individual room assignments. A communal area visible at the hallway's end, complete with furniture designed for species that sat with their spines vertical. Room D733 was 3 doors down on the left. Vrix approached first, security scanner active, ready for anything. The door was unlocked because humans apparently had a casual relationship with personal security that made every other species nervous. He triggered the door override. The room beyond was dark, quiet, and contained absolutely no signs of violence, struggle, or distress. Just a sleeping human in a bed, curled on her side, breathing peacefully. And there, on the pillow beside the human's head, was a small silver-blue ball of fur, also sleeping peacefully. One tiny paw stretched out to rest against the human's hair. The retrieval team stared. The cub snored softly, a tiny sound that shouldn't have been audible but somehow carried in the silent room. The human continued sleeping, completely oblivious to the diplomatic crisis she was currently hosting on her pillow. Professor Thex made a sound that the translation matrix couldn't properly interpret, something between relief and utter bewilderment. Well, the administrator said quietly, this is going to require some paperwork. The standoff lasted approximately 45 seconds before the human's alarm began its gentle, ascending chime, a sound designed to ease someone from sleep rather than jolt them into consciousness. Because, of course, humans had engineered even their wake-up calls to be considerate. The young woman stirred, reaching out automatically to silence the alarm. Her hand passed within centimeters of the cub, who continued sleeping with the dedication of someone who had found the perfect spot and refused to acknowledge that morning existed. Then the human opened her eyes, processed the armed security team standing in her doorway, and did what any reasonable person would do when waking to find their room invaded. She screamed. The cub woke up immediately, saw strangers, and made a sound that was probably meant to be threatening but came out more like a squeaky toy being stepped on. The human scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed, and finally noticed the small furry creature on her pillow. Her expression cycled through confusion, shock, recognition, and then something the translator couldn't quite parse but looked suspiciously like delight. Oh my God, when did you get here? The cub, startled but not frightened, did what cubs do when confused. She ran toward the nearest safe thing, which her infant brain had decided was the human. She scrambled across the bed and attempted to climb into the young woman's lap. The retrieval team tensed. Professor Thex moved forward instinctively. The human, apparently operating on some kind of primal nurturing instinct that overrode common sense, caught the cub and cradled her against her chest. Hey, it's okay. You're okay, she murmured, one hand automatically stroking the silver-blue fur. You're probably scared with all these people here, huh? The cub burrowed into her arms and began purring. Threxian cubs did not purr. They chirped, they growled, they made hunting sounds. They did not purr, except apparently they did when held by humans. The medical officer pulled out a scanner, hands shaking slightly. Permission to approach and examine the cub, Professor? Professor Thex looked like they were trying to reconcile several contradictory realities simultaneously. Yes, please. The doctor moved carefully toward the bed. The human watched with concern, but didn't resist, simply holding the cub steady while the scanner passed over her small body. "No injuries," the doctor announced, sounding genuinely surprised. "No stress markers. Cortisol levels are actually lower than baseline. She's completely fine. Better than fine, actually. I didn't even know she was here," the human explained, still absently petting the cub. "I would have contacted someone immediately if I'd woken up and found her. Is she lost? Are you her parent?" This last question directed at Professor Thex. "I am," the professor confirmed, stepping closer. "She managed to escape our quarters through the ventilation system." "Oh no, you must have been so worried." The human's distress was genuine, immediate. "Here, you should take her." "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." She tried to hand the cub over. The cub, displaying the stubbornness that would serve her well in adulthood, clung to the human's sleep shirt and refused to let go. "She appears to have bonded with you," the medical officer observed clinically, though their tone suggested this was both fascinating and deeply problematic. The human looked helpless. "I'm really sorry. I don't know why she's doing this." The administrator found her voice, finally. "This is why humans are isolated." Everyone turned to look at her. "Not because you're dangerous," she continued, addressing the increasingly confused young woman. "Because everything finds you safe, comforting. Every species we've studied shows decreased stress responses around humans. Cubs, juveniles, even some adults exhibit attachment behaviors. The Quilnari elder incident, the Vrix hatchling situation last year, that whole mess with a Kelton adolescent who refused to return to their family pod. We're isolated because we're too friendly?" the human interrupted, sounding insulted. "You're isolated because you turn everything into a therapy session," Vrix corrected, removing his ridiculous helmet. "And because half the species on this station would probably end up trying to live with you if given the opportunity." The human processed this. The cub, sensing the conversation had shifted away from immediate cuddles, began investigating her new friend's hair with great interest. "So what happens now?" the young woman asked. Professor Thex watched their cub, who was completely content, absolutely safe, and showing no inclination to return to proper Threxian supervision. Their expression suggested they were having a crisis of several different kinds. "Now," the administrator said with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in her soul, "we figure out how to explain this in a report that won't cause a complete review of station integration protocols." The human looked down at the cub, who had fallen asleep again, this time draped across her arm like a very content scarf. "Can I at least give her breakfast first?" she asked. "She's probably hungry." The medical officer made a noise that might have been a laugh, hastily converted into a cough. This, right here, was exactly the problem. The emergency meeting convened 3 hours later in the main conference room, after the human had indeed provided breakfast, which the cub had eaten enthusiastically while sitting in her lap. The medical officer had documented this with the kind of detailed notes usually reserved for discovering new laws of physics. The debate raged for 90 minutes, touching on policy revision, liability concerns, precedent setting, and whether this incident would open floodgates they couldn't close. Species representatives argued. Administrators consulted legal frameworks. Someone suggested closing the human program entirely, which caused an uproar from the academic council because apparently humans were exceptional students when they weren't accidentally collecting alien children. Professor Thex sat quietly through most of it, watching through the conference room window as their cub played in the adjacent observation area under the human's supervision. The young woman had brought homework. The cub was attempting to eat it. The concern, one administrator stated carefully, is that allowing this bonding to continue sets a dangerous precedent. We cannot have students from protected species forming attachments to humans. The cub is already attached, the medical officer countered. Forcing separation now could cause genuine psychological harm. Threxian cubs form primary bonds during this developmental stage. Breaking that bond prematurely has documented negative outcomes. Are you suggesting we leave a Threxian cub in the care of a human student? The administrator's tone suggested this was the most absurd thing she'd heard all week, which, given the week's events, was saying something. "I'm suggesting we acknowledge reality," the doctor replied. "The Cub chose her safe person. Fighting that choice helps no one." Professor Thex finally spoke. "I will stay in the human section." The room went silent. "I will transfer my quarters to Section D7. I will supervise the Cub and monitor the situation directly. This satisfies safety requirements while allowing the bond to develop naturally." "You want to live with humans?" someone asked, incredulous. "I want my Cub to thrive," Professor Thex corrected. "If that requires adapting to unusual circumstances, then I adapt. It's what we do as parents." The vote took another hour, but eventually passed with narrow approval. Temporary arrangement, pending review, subject to immediate termination if any safety concerns arose. The bureaucratic language that meant everyone was covering themselves while allowing something unprecedented to happen. The young woman took the news with the kind of calm acceptance that suggested she'd already known how it would end. She'd acquired a roommate, essentially, and seemed more concerned about whether there were dietary restrictions she should know about. 3 weeks later, the station adjusted. Professor Thex's quantum mechanics lectures became surprisingly popular, possibly because students wanted to see if living with humans had changed them. It hadn't, except they now understood 17 new ways humans could turn mundane situations into bonding opportunities. The Cub thrived. She split time between both guardians, learning Threxian hunting behaviors from her parent and apparently human socialization from her chosen safe person. The medical officer published a paper. The administrative protocols got updated. Life continued. Other species began requesting quarters closer to the human section. Not in it, of course. That would be too much. But nearby. Close enough to benefit from whatever strange, calming effect humans had on the station's general anxiety levels. The isolation protocols remained in place, technically. But the boundaries had shifted, softened by a Cub who'd simply wanted a comfortable pillow and found something better. Humans remained weird. The galaxy was learning to work with that rather than against it. Progress looked strange sometimes, but it still counted as progress. And in room D733, a young woman studied for her exams while a silver-blue Cub napped on her pillow, exactly where this whole complicated situation had started. Some things, apparently, were just meant to be, regardless of what the regulations said about it. The universe, finally paying attention, found the whole thing appropriately ridiculous and moved on to other concerns. Entropy could wait. This was more entertaining. A Cub snuck into the human dorm, curled beside her pillow. Conclusion 6 months after the incident that would forever be known in station records as the pillow situation. Intersystem Collegiate Station 7 had transformed in ways nobody predicted. The human section remained technically isolated, but the walls had become more suggestion than barrier. 5 different species now had approved visitation schedules. The therapy animal program, previously thought impossible in a multi-species environment, launched successfully with humans as the primary handlers. The young woman graduated with honors in xenobiology, her thesis focusing on cross-species bonding behaviors. She had excellent primary source material, considering the silver-blue shadow that followed her everywhere. The Cub, now approaching adolescence, displayed hunting behaviors that her parent taught her alongside social skills that definitely came from human influence. She was turning into something unprecedented, a bridge between 2 very different ways of existing in the universe. Professor Thex published groundbreaking research on adaptive parenting across species barriers. Colleagues whispered that living with humans had made them soft. They didn't care. Their Cub was happy, healthy, and learning to navigate a complex galaxy with unusual grace. The isolation protocols stayed in the official handbook. Everyone just stopped enforcing them quite so rigidly. Sometimes the rules needed to bend before they could evolve into something better. Humans remained weird. The galaxy was finally okay with that.